This week we're talking about cinematography and going through lots of examples of how different camera techniques will have different effects on the audience. Hello, my name is Simon Cade and this is DSLR Guide. So this is the first part in a series all about cinematography, where we'll be looking at using the camera and lighting to tell stories. So in this first part, we're focusing on where to place the camera and how to set up the layout of your scene so that we can get a certain reaction from the audience. So the first thing to think about is depth. Now, I think that this is one of the biggest differences between amateur filmmaking and the movies that we see at the cinema. So what I mean by depth is when the images look three-dimensional, when there's a big difference between the foreground elements, the midground, and the background. And this can usually be achieved by looking out for perspective lines going off into the distance. Or another thing you can do is have a frame in the foreground, something which provides a natural frame. This can really help to add some real depth, and it makes the shots a lot richer and more pleasing to the eye. If you look at any painting or photo or any shot from a film, they often have really nice depth in them, which makes it a really rich frame. Now, you may choose to avoid depth and have very flat images, perhaps if you want the audience to feel lonely or detached, or for a character who feels trapped and like they haven't got any space to move around, or maybe if they're in a really boring lifestyle, you would also use flat images. But because we see really rich shots with lots of depth, every time we go to the cinema, the audience has an expectation that the shots will have depth. So if you accidentally shoot the whole film really flat, then that might leave a very different impression on the audience to what you're going for. Now, I believe it was Alfred Hitchcock who said that the size of something within the frame is directly reflecting how important it is to the film. So if we look at this example from The King's Speech, then the main character is very apprehensive about doing public speaking. So notice how the microphone is huge and it's kind of covering up his face at times, and it shows how this microphone is really important to him and it was really overwhelming for him to have to do this public speaking. Now, this is also commonly used to show the relationship between characters. In this famous scene from Citizen Kane, the main character is very far away, dwarfed by the other two characters, but as he takes control of the situation, he walks close to the camera and then he towers above them. So notice how this wasn't random. They actually used the size of characters to change just as the story changes, just as the characters change. Now, the next thing is contrast. Our eyes are naturally drawn to high contrast parts of an image. So if you put your main character behind something that's very low contrast and doesn't make them stand out, then it can often be hard for the audience to even see where they are. Now, the other thing to note is whether there's something really high contrast which could actually be distracting the audience's eyes from where they should be looking, in this case maybe at the main character. So once you understand contrast, you can decide whether you want your characters to really stand out or whether you do want them to blend into the background a bit. So if you have a really shy character, for example, low contrast might be a great way to go. So in general though, you don't want the audience to have to search around and look for them. The kind of standard is to have high contrast so that they can see what's going on. And it's worth noting that contrast isn't just about dark and bright things. In this image, the circle stands out because it's brighter, but in this one, the most colourful part of the frame is where our eyes tend to hang around. Whereas this circle stands out because it's contrasting with the other circles, but this time in size. And the same rule applies for shape. A good cinematographer uses all kinds of contrast in order to show and hide certain things from the audience. But what about the different types of shots? Well, the traditional way to enter a scene would be to have an establishing wide shot, which shows the audience exactly where everything is and the setting, as well as giving some hints about the time of day. But what if you decided to be unconventional and just throw the audience straight in with a close-up so they don't really know what's going on? Maybe they feel a bit disorientated, but that could work very well for your scene, depending on what kind of vibe you're going for. On a more practical level, wide shots can be important to show body language or props or maybe even costume. So let's say you have someone walking down the street and they're really frustrated, so they keep kicking this can. Well, if you'd shot that in extreme close-ups, then you might not have been able to see the can at all. So we would have lost that emotional cue for frustration. And speaking of close-ups, they give the audience the opportunity to be most personal and intimate with the characters. And when used sparingly, they're often more powerful. Just like in music, you have moments of quiet, which then will make the loud parts seem even more powerful. So I think the good principle for all of this is to go back to the Citizen Kane shot, because I think that cinematography is most effective when there are changes that then reflect the story, or maybe the characters making a decision, or the story going in a new direction. So next up is a whole bunch of techniques all condensed into what I'd call balance. So this is just following the general guides of framing. So by this I mean using the rule of thirds to place our subjects somewhere in the frame that looks very natural. It's keeping heads in the frame. Here's a before and after. It's also worth keeping the camera on a level horizon. Again, another before and after. And it's also framing to give your characters looking room, where they have space on the side of the frame that they are facing. So most of the time we're pretty much aiming for shots that are as balanced as possible. I'd say that 95% of shots from Hollywood films are pretty much well balanced, and if you accidentally set your camera to be off balance, whether that's through the horizon being a bit off or not giving your actors enough headroom or looking room, then it can really have a bad effect on the vibe that you're going for. But of course you could purposefully make your shots unbalanced. Maybe if your character is going off the rails, or if they're just really unpredictable, then that could be a really useful storytelling device. But in general, I'd recommend being pretty subtle about this most of the time, because it really can be distracting from the story if you push it too far. So how far away from each other you position characters can say a lot about their relationship. So let's say you have a shot of a kid who's feeling really left out, where you might actually make some distance between them and the other people to show that emotional distance. And of course you can flip this by having your characters close together, which suggests trust and intimacy. And in a great blog post by Shane Hulbert, he talks about how in his film Crazy Beautiful, he used over-the-shoulder shots with plenty of distance to begin with, but then as their relationship deepened, the gap between them closed. And finally, let's talk about the height of the camera. Now, if you set it up at eye level, then you're giving a pretty neutral impression to the audience, but then think of the phrases, they really look up to them, compared to, oh yeah, they really look down on them. They have very big connotations. Looking up to someone makes them sound quite heroic, while looking down on someone makes them sound quite vulnerable. So in films, they often use this as a very simple way to establish who has the dominance in a scene. Now, I would like to add that just because, let's say you had a character who was feeling overwhelmed, that doesn't mean that you have to shoot them from a high angle and set it to being off balance and give them no looking room and use every single one of the features. It's kind of a case of picking and choosing which ones you think will work best for the story. But it is worth remembering that all of the techniques I've talked about in this video are completely up for interpretation. When it comes to adding the music and the dialogue and the kind of backstory, any of these features could be used to kind of convey a completely different emotion. So there's no way that these are rules, they're just kind of guidelines, and you kind of look at the way that some filmmakers have done it and then decide which parts you want to take and which parts you want to leave. So my advice is just to watch lots of films and to be really intentional with your cinematography choices, and it's always based on what the story is and what the vibe of your scene is and what the characters are like. So that's pretty much it for this week. I would like to say that on the blog post I'll link to a whole bunch of videos which have taught me loads about composition and all the stuff that I've been talking about in this video, so do check that out if you're interested, link in the description. But that's it for this week, and I'll see you next time.